great deal of tragedy going on in the world. I know that at times there are people around this Congress that have felt very much alone. I know there have been times when presidents have felt very much alone, like Abraham Lincoln. A year or so after his son had died, his wife was fussing at him. He was going to commemorate a battlefield. There have been people who've been very alone in this town, but, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that no one in the world feels more betrayed and dejected than the leader of our former friend Israel. Now, Israel is still the friend of many of ours. We still hold it in the highest regard because of its similarity in beliefs and human rights that we have here, even there in the midst of the Middle East. The president's announced that he's going to the United Nations to get their approval before he would even ask for a vote in Congress. That struck a chord, that rang a bell. March of 2011, a letter from the White House in which the president advises that, he says, at my direction, U.S. military forces commenced operations to assist an international effort authorized by the United Nations Security Council and undertaken with the support of European allies and Arab partners to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe and address the threat posed to international peace and security by the crisis in Libya. The trouble is, Mr. Speaker, that our president created the catastrophe, created the crisis, the real crisis in Libya as it exists today, far worse than anything that anybody conceived would or could exist in 2011, where the president went to the UN to seek authority instead of coming to Congress. Since 2003, Gaddafi had given up all efforts at supporting terrorism. He had given up all efforts at pursuing weapons that the United States did not give him authority to keep. As some of our Muslim Arab leaders in the Middle East have told some of us privately, since 2003, Gaddafi was doing more to help you tamp out terrorism than most anybody in the world. And yet this president decided that a small problem in Libya was enough to justify him taking out Gaddafi. Oh, I know, we were going to create a no-fly zone, but let's be serious. The president's bombing runs that he authorized ended up, even in the face of Gaddafi asking to be allowed to just leave and leave the country peaceably, he asked for a response within 3 days, and this president authorized bombing apparently as an answer. So make no mistake, the incredibly bad judgment in this White House created a debacle in northern Africa that has spilled into other nations around Libya, that has created all kinds of human atrocities, that has created a massive movement of people heading for boats from Libya, heading north to anywhere they can go. This president did that without authorization of Congress, caused that without authorization of Congress. But he did have the consent of the United Nations, as he now says he's going to seek before he gets approval for his Iranian deal in Congress. March 21st of 2011, an article by Charlie Savage in the New York Times points out that some Democratic lawmakers, including Representatives Gerald Nadler of New York, Barbara Lee of California, Michael Capuano of Massachusetts, complained in a House Democratic Caucus conference call as the bombing began that Mr. Obama had exceeded his constitutional authority by authorizing the attack without congressional permission. I'd have to say that my friend Mr. Nadler, Ms. Lee, Mr. Capuano of Massachusetts, they were right. I haven't said that a whole lot about my friend Mr. Nadler, but he was right. The article goes on Monday, Mr. Obama sent Congress a two-page letter saying that as commander-in-chief, he had constitutional authority to authorize the strikes, which were undertaken with French, British, and other allies. The article points out that as a presidential candidate who promoted his background as an instructor of constitutional law, Mr. Obama appeared to adopt a more limited view of executive power when he answered a question about whether a president could order the bombing of Iranian nuclear sites without a use of force authorization from Congress. Then it quotes Mr. Obama, says the president does not have authority under the Constitution to unilaterally authorize a military attack in a situation that does not involve stopping an actual or imminent threat to the nation. Mr. Obama told the Boston Globe in December 2007. Mentions further down that in the Globe survey, Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., then a senator, argued that a president would have no authority under the Constitution to bomb Iranian nuclear sites without congressional authorization because even limited strikes can unintentionally prompt all-out war. Well, they violated what Mr. Obama and Mr. Biden said before they were in the White House and the vice president's quarters. They created a disaster in northern Africa because they believed that their opinion was adequate and that the massive number of countries in the United Nations that hate Israel was better confidants than Congress. Regardless of whether that's true or not, it's not constitutional. In 2011, March, there was a National Review article by Bill Burke. Points out President Obama's war in Libya is unconstitutional without congressional authorization. But that is so only because the president has not yet given a reason to fight that is constitutionally sound. And it goes on. So the president helped create this massive disaster in northern Africa that has human tragedy occurring day after day, people fleeing in boats, some dying trying to get away from the Libya that he created because he decided it was time for Gaddafi to go. Some of our Muslim leader friends in North Africa and the Middle East continue to ask, does your president not understand that he keeps helping the people that are at war with the United States? Does your president not understand that he is harming the people that are helping stop terrorism in the world? This deal that has now been cut with Iran, the largest supporter of terrorism in the world is going to do for the Middle East and the world what President Obama's bombing did for Libya. It has to be stopped. This deal has to be stopped. It does not meet any of the requirements that the president and all his minions said was going to come out of a deal with Iran. And, oh, yes, there were celebrations here in Washington because they were able to convince Iran into taking back over $100 billion. And also, we were able to convince them to allow us to take them off the arms embargo so they could go ahead and start buying weapons from Russia, from China, wherever they wish. Let's help the Russian economy. Let's help the Chinese economy. Let's give hundreds of billions of dollars to the largest supporter of terrorism in the world and allow them to pursue arms with that money. Isn't there enough terrorism in the world today without this administration being accomplices to death and destruction the world over through the assistance, through this so-called deal that it has cut with Iran? Article from, certainly not a great press friend of the United States, but AFP, the Agency France Press, has an article from Tehran. It says, hardliners in Tehran brought up on chance of death to America have repeatedly voiced opposition to the quest for a deal with a power derided as the Great Satan ever since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. The article goes on further and says, rather than representing submission to the West, the agreement is likely to consolidate Khomeini's rule, according to David Hermidez Bavand, a veteran political analyst at Tehran University. And make no mistake, this is Tehran, that's in Iran, from a veteran political analyst that serves at the pleasure, or keeps his life at the pleasure of Khomeini. Article says, the evident contradictions of a pact with the Great Satan, the core of Iran's nuclear program has been preserved. Thank you, President Barack Hussein Obama. Yes, I know there are people celebrating in Washington. Yeah, we got a great deal. We got them to take $100 billion off our hands. We got them to agree to start being able for they themselves to buy arms. We got them off the terrorist watch list so they can move more freely as they want to create terrorism. It's a great day. Oh, it's time to celebrate. This article, in what may be one of the most understated comments about the deal, says, quote, it probably amounts to a marginal win over Israel, Saudi Arabia, and even Turkey. And that's from Mr. Bavand, describing the nuclear deal as a step forward for the war-racked Middle East. Article from Max Boot in commentarymagazine.com points out that for a more succinct account, go right to the statement issued by Tehran's official Islamic news agency. And this comes from that. World powers have recognized Iran's peaceful nuclear program and are to respect the nuclear rights of Iranian nation within international conventions. Second, says this, and this is from Iran. The Islamic of Iran is to be recognized as a nuclear technology power authorized to have peaceful nuclear programs such as compare fuel cycle and enrichment to be identified by the United Nations. All unfair sanctions imposed by the UN Security Council, including economic and financial sanctions on Iran, are to be lifted as per the agreement and through the issuance of a new resolution by the United Nations Security Council, most all of which hate Israel. All nuclear installations and sites are to continue their work, contrary to the early demands of the other party, that would be the United States. None of them will be dismantled. That is Iran's interpretation of the deal being celebrated down the street here, down Pennsylvania Avenue. They're celebrating because they say none of their nuclear facilities have to be dismantled. Goes on, the policy of preventing enrichment uranium is now failed, and Iran will go ahead with its enrichment program. Further from Iran, they declare that Iran's nuclear infrastructure will remain intact. No centrifuges will be dismantled, and research and development on key and advanced centrifuges will continue. And that's rather amazing. Now, we heard the president say that they were going to have to dismantle like 2/3 of their centrifuges. But it appears, from what we can find out about the deal so far, that actually they may dismantle some of the centrifuges, but only because we are going to help them install and work with the most advanced centrifuges in the world. More advanced than anything Iran would have now. So far as we know, this is a huge boon to their nuclear efforts. This article says the agreement specifies that it would take no fewer than 24 days to compel an inspection, talking about the sites, nuclear sites. That's plenty of time for the Iranians to sanitize any suspect site so as to remove any evidence of nuclear activity, and is far removed from the kind of 24/7 access that President Obama said just today that inspectors would have. The Iranians insisted that the agreement stick only to the nuclear issue. That's why, for example, the Iranians did not agree as part of this deal to release the American hostages that they are holding, or to end their support for terrorism, or their commitment to Israel's destruction. But it turns out the agreement isn't just limited to nuclear issues. It includes a commitment to lift the conventional arms embargo on Iran in no more than 5 years, and the embargo on missile sales to Iran in no more than 8 years, and probably sooner if Iran is said to be in compliance with the nuclear accord. And gee, won't that be interesting? They may be able to have people that hate Israel give them the go-ahead much earlier than 8 years. This article points out what this means is that Iran will soon have more than $100 billion extra to spend not only on exporting the Iranian Revolution and dominating neighboring states, but that it will also, before long, be free to purchase as many weapons, even ballistic missiles, as it likes on the world market. No wonder Vladimir Putin appears to be happy. This deal is likely to become a windfall for the Russian arms makers, although you can be sure that Iran will also spread its largesse to manufacturers in France and, if possible, the UK, so as to give those countries an extra stake in not reimposing sanctions. And that's good news for Ukraine, good news for Georgia, because this means that this deal, if it goes through, And the president's already saying we're going to lift these sanctions. We're going to get them the $100 billion plus dollars. Some say it's going to be $150 billion. Can you imagine what Russia can do with money that Iran pays it? Why, they could probably take over all of Ukraine with that kind of money. And then the Russians, as they take over more and more of Ukraine, they can be putting big posters on their tanks saying, "Thank you, President Obama. Without your deal with Iran, we would never have had the money to take over Ukraine." And what about Egypt? This is devastating news that this deal is coming to fruition for Egypt. When over 30 million Egyptians come to the street, it would be like over 100 million Americans going to the streets and demanding the ouster of the Muslim brother president, seizing all power and demanding that he be gotten rid of. The military did as the people of Egypt ordered. What an incredible, peaceful uprising. That was impeachment as peaceably as it could be done, since the Americans assisting Egypt did not even help them put in an impeachment provision in their constitution. It's bad news, obviously, for Saudi Arabia. It's bad news for Jordan. It's bad news for all countries in the Middle East. It's bad news for Syria. It's bad news for Turkey. Oh, there will be some in Turkey, some in Syria that will be just shouting with joy, particularly President Assad. He may need to send President Obama a thank you note for the money that comes flowing in to help him in Syria, perhaps. But there's going to be money spread all around to weapons makers, to people who peddle war and destruction because of what this president has done and agreed to without any promise, not even a promise of giving up terrorism, not even a promise, not even a verbal promise, for heaven's sake, that Iran will not try to destroy Israel. Well, we had this article from AFP also back March 2nd of 2015, this year. The article says, quote, Obama told Reuters that if, quote, if Iran is willing to agree to double-digit years of from where it is, unquote, there'd be a deal. Well, that's not what President Obama agreed to. This article goes on, and again, this is March. Netanyahu on Monday told a pro-Israel conference that a deal with Iran would, quote, threaten the survival of Israel, unquote. Obama said that sentiment is wrong-headed, noting Netanyahu's previous opposition to an interim Iran deal as evidence Israel should back the talks. Quote, Netanyahu made all sorts of claims. This was going to be a terrible deal. This was going to result in Iran getting $50 billion worth of relief. Iran would not abide by the agreement. None of that has come true. Well, it turns out the president was the one who was wrong, and Prime Minister Netanyahu is the one that it was exactly right, that it was a bad deal, that this was a terrible deal. He was right. Now, I have to admit, Mr. Speaker, that Prime Minister Netanyahu was extremely wrong about one aspect of the Iranian deal between it and President Obama. I have to admit, I think the world of President Netanyahu. He's a great man, has the potential to be one of Israel's truly great leaders. But he was wrong when he said that this deal was going to result in Iran getting $50 billion worth of relief. he was way wrong, because they're going to get maybe $150 billion of relief, but certainly over $100 billion of relief. So we got to chalk it up. That's the one area that President Obama was right about Netanyahu being wrong. Netanyahu understated the amount of cash this administration was willing to fork over to the terrorist state of Iran. It wasn't $50 billion. It was over $100 billion, possibly $150 billion. So there it is on the record. Netanyahu was wrong. He said $50 billion is what Iran would get, and it was over 100. So let's look at this deal and what was been said in the past about it. Undersecretary of State Wendy Sherman, the Speaker, you'll remember that she's the one of those who was key in the negotiations with North Korea, where we gave them nuclear power plants and material, and all we got in return was a promise that if we just gave them everything they needed, all the technology to make nuclear bombs, they'd use it for nuclear power plant. And of course, we know they broke their word. When you're dealing with a scorpion and it stings you, you shouldn't ask later, why did you do that? You know why. The answer to the old fable is, because I'm a scorpion. It's what I do. And that's what the leader of North Korea is, and it's what he did. And if you look at the leaders of Iran, similar fable about the snake. Man warms the snake up and it ends up biting him. Why did you do that? Because I'm a snake. So perhaps in the near future, President Obama, Secretary Kerry will be heard to ask, why did you break all these terms? Because we're snakes. That's what we do, should be the answer. But Wendy Sherman said in February 4th of 2014, nearly a year and a half ago, she said about the deal, we raised possible military dimensions, and in fact, in the joint plan of action, we have required that Iran come clean on its past actions as part of any comprehensive agreement. Well, that didn't happen. Wendy Sherman was as wrong about that as she was about North Korea not using the nuclear capacity we gave them to make nuclear weapons. Of course, December 7, 2013, President Obama himself said, it's my strong belief that we can envision an end state that gives us an assurance that even if they have some modest enrichment capability, is so constrained and the inspections so intrusive that they, as a practical matter, do not have breakout capacity. Now, that's a great statement there, because he's not saying that we'll get Iran to that point. If you look carefully, he says that we'll have an end state that gives us an assurance. Oh, well, Iran is willing to give us assurance, but they're not even willing to give us an assurance of what President Obama hoped for goodness sake. Secretary Kerry said November 24, 2013, quote, there is no right to enrich. We do not recognize a right to enrich. It is clear in the NPT, in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it's very, very clear there's no right to enrich. Well, now we know that Secretary Kerry was very, very wrong about it being very, very clear there was no right to enrich. Not only is there a right to enrich, we're going to help Iran enrich. Thank you, President Obama. Sanctions relief. Here's a quote from John Kerry from March 3rd. Secretary of State Kerry said, quote, Iran is not open for business, is closed for nuclear bombs. Well, we know that's not going to be the case. They're open for business, and they're still enriching. Again, Undersecretary of State Wendy Sherman said, quote, this includes a lot of dismantling of their infrastructure. Well, it turns out that's not the case either. Undersecretary of State Wendy Sherman, February 4th of 2014, said it's true that in these first 6 months, we've not shut down all their production of any ballistic missile. Well, it turns out they're not going to at all. How about that? March 5th, 2015, Secretary Kerry Quote, it will reduce the pressure for a regional nuclear race, and it will increase the strength of the international non-proliferation regime. It will also vastly improve the prospects for peace both here and elsewhere. Secretary Kerry was wrong, wrong, wrong. And now they want the UN to pass the deal. Well, gosh, I'm sure they'll get plenty of votes from people that want the money that the U.S. is going to make sure Iran has to buy nuclear weapons. So, Prime Minister Netanyahu says...
Gentleman's time has expired.
The Iran deal is a grave mistake, and he is as right now as he was before this.